42 here. Funny how some words stick with you, isn't it? I distinctly remember the first time I heard the word bedlam. I was a child and we were in a crowded shopping centre on Christmas Eve. You can picture the scene. Wild eyes, foaming mouths, the war cries of fully grown adults commencing shopping-based battle over the last Tamagotchi on the shelf. Pure bedlam! That's how one man described this terrifying glimpse into the pure cray-cray that simmers just below the surface of your average Christmas shopper as closing time approaches. It's an unassuming word, bedlam. It means chaos and confusion, but it's usually used to describe fairly innocuous situations. A children's birthday party when the jelly and cake-induced sugar rush kicks in, or the wild celebrations after your favourite sports team records an important victory in the cup. But don't let the modern usage fool you, because the origin of the word bedlam traces its roots back through history to one of the most infamous and brutal institutions the world has ever seen. This is the story of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, better known as Bedlam Mental Asylum. Now, I've got a mystery for all of you that's evaded an answer for almost a century. Why would one of the richest families in history store almost $1 billion of their wealth away in fine art? Well, there's lots of theories, and maybe we'll never know for sure, but we do know some facts about contemporary art today. Contemporary art prices outpaced the S&P 500 by 164% from 1995 to 2021. With numbers like that, you can start to imagine why the Rockefellers are part of a trend that continues today, where over 2/3 of billionaires allocate more than 20% of their overall portfolio to art. Now, the mystery is, how do you do it? Well, that I can give you a concrete answer to. With Masterworks. I've talked about them on this channel before, and I think what they're doing is genius. But some of you may think it's too expensive to get access to. Well, I want to put that notion to rest. Forget what you thought about the art market and that it's reserved for the ultra-wealthy. In fact, members of the 42 community have already invested with Masterworks. And with the stock market being so crazy recently and equity firms predicting real returns of 5% or less, now is the right time to look at diversifying your portfolio. And Masterworks is how I'm choosing to do that. And luckily for you, Masterworks has provided my viewers with priority access. So go check them out using the link in the description and see the new offering that they have on their platform. Bethlehem Royal Hospital was the UK's very first insane asylum, and the first institution in Europe to focus solely on treating the mentally ill. Today's version of the hospital can be found in Beckenham, Kent, and though it's existed on several sites over the years, it's always been regarded as a leading centre of its time for the treatment of mental illness. Of course, that hasn't always been anything much to be proud of. You don't have to go too far back in history before you reach a time when cutting-edge treatments for ailments of the mind meant spinning your patient in a chair suspended from the ceiling until they passed out, vomited, or bled from the ears. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The establishment that would one day become known as Bedlam first opened its doors as a priory dedicated to St. Mary of Bethlehem close to 800 years ago in 1247. It was commissioned as a way of collecting donations for the Crusades rather than as a hospital, but like many religious institutions, it also provided sanctuary for those with nowhere else to go. The original building was erected on top of a sewer that regularly overflowed, and that was fitting, because Bethlehem would soon become home to people that society at the time viewed as little more than human waste. Like nail salons and money laundering, poverty and mental illness have often been linked. From the outset, the people Bethlehem would have taken in were likely to be destitute, as well as suffering from various forms of mental illness. Bethlehem officially became a hospital in 1337. Though in medieval times, hospital really just meant a place for those in need, which included society's disabled and abandoned. Doctors were also unrecognisable from their modern counterparts. They needed no qualifications, and rather than spending many years learning the impossible intricacies of the human body, they pretty much just rocked up to work one day and figured things out through trial and error. Well, error. Putting your life in the hands of a doctor in the 1200s was a bit like trusting a pilot who's trained by flying paper aeroplanes, or asking an engineer to build your house because he's pretty handy with Lego. I.e., there was a good chance it was going to get you killed. The first concrete evidence of people with mental illness being treated in Bethlehem comes from a report written in 1403, as well as recording the number of patients suffering from insanity in the hospital at the time, 6. The report also, rather ominously, made an inventory of some of the equipment in use, including 4 pairs of manacles, 6 locks, 11 chains, and 2 pairs of stocks. The purpose of these items wasn't specified in the report, but I think it's pretty obvious what it was all for. BDSM? Well, either that or to restrain the patients, I guess. By 1406, Bethlehem had shifted from the role of general hospital to purely focusing on being an insane asylum, and the building had become a London landmark. In medieval times, it was believed that madness was brought about by a disease of the body, and strong medicines were used to purge the patient in a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. In addition to bouts of induced vomiting and diarrhea, bloodletting was also practiced. Another way of literally drawing out the melancholy was by applying abrasive substances to the skin, causing it to blister. Just in case anyone started to feel too comfortable whilst being subject to this routine treatment, regular degradations like head shaving and freezing cold baths were administered too. The people of London have a long history of playing around with language, and over the centuries the word Bethlehem eventually morphed into Bedlam. By the 1600s, this new word had infiltrated the English language so completely that it's still in common use today, though most people have no idea of its disturbing origin. One of the main reasons for Bedlam's infamy was that from around the 1550s, patients with metal identification armbands were sent out into the streets of London to beg for money to support the hospital's maintenance. These pitiful souls were clearly successful, if I can even use that word in this context. Bedlam's poor were named as one of the main sights of London, and in 1598, the governors of Bethlehem decided to open the hospital doors to spectators who would pay to watch the asylum's inhabitants in what became a literal human zoo. Profiting from thousands of paying visitors coming to ogle mentally ill patients is perhaps one of the most scandalous parts of Bedlam's history, but the campaign netted the institution around £400 a year, more than £70,000 in today's money, which probably explains why it went on for almost 2 centuries. What's a little moral depravity when there's money to be made, hey? With demand for the unique entertainments available at Bethlehem on the rise, a new building was constructed in 1676. Not only was Bethlehem 2.0 larger than the institution it replaced, it was also unbelievably grand. Inspired by the Tuileries Palace in Paris, it soon became known as a palace for lunatics. But a turd still stinks no matter how much Chanel No. 5 you spray on it, and despite the fancy makeover, Bethlehem Hospital remained a truly awful place for all those unlucky enough to find themselves on the wrong side of its tastefully designed walls. Doctors' posts were passed on to family and friends, ensuring that primitive and torturous treatments endured. If you're wondering how the hospital's inmates were able to withstand such abuse, the simple truth is, they didn't. Modern investigations have unearthed mass graves where brutalized patients were simply piled on top of one another and forgotten about. All in all, there wasn't anything progressive about the new Bedlam. It was all a front. It did achieve one of its primary goals, though. It attracted more paying tourists. With those visitors came pickpockets, food vendors, and even prostitutes. And hospital staff would bolster their income by offering private tours. Due to overwhelming numbers, especially during holidays, the number of paying visitors began to be restricted from about 1770. And by the 1780s, calls to reform the system saw public tours stopped altogether. On the face of it, that was a good thing, but it came with an unexpected and unfortunate side effect. There was now less outside scrutiny than ever on what went on behind Bedlam's gates. In 1728, Dr. James Monroe was appointed as the physician of Bedlam. He was the first in a family dynasty of infamous doctors, 4 of whom would be responsible for Bethlem's patients for the next 150 years in an incredible display of nepotism. These physicians were hugely influential. 2 of them were even consulted in the case of Mad King George III, who was well known to suffer from mental illness. The methods applied by the Monroes in Bethlehem were criticised as being outdated and cruel. There was a focus on restraint, beatings, and general mistreatment of the patients who could just as easily have been described as prisoners. One of the most vocal critics of Bethlem's practices was Dr. William Batty, the chief physician of nearby St. Luke's Hospital for pauper lunatics. At St. Luke's, there was no public viewings, little use of restraints, and generally a more humane treatment of patients. Around 70% of patients were cured, in comparison to around 15% in other pauper asylums like Bethlehem, where methods were rooted in archaic ideas about mental illness being linked with sin or possession by demons. It wasn't until 1815 and a parliamentary investigation into the running of so-called madhouses in England that a spotlight was finally shone on the horror of places like Bethlehem. As the extent of the depravities were uncovered, Bedlam head honcho Thomas Monroe was forced to resign, though naturally his son, Edward Thomas Monroe, was waiting in the wings to take over the family business of caring for England's mentally ill. Like his father before him, Edward Thomas preferred to stick to traditional methods, but that all changed with his son, Henry Monroe, the last in the lineage of what became known as the Mad Doctors of Bedlam. Unlike the 4 Monroes before him, Henry wrote published works on mental illness and held progressive beliefs. He was against the practices that had been advocated by his family, and in 1854 he was appointed physician at St. Luke's, Bethlem's fierce rival. The findings of the Parliamentary Committee in 1815 made it clear that the methods employed at Bedlam desperately needed to be overhauled, and so did the building itself. It was dilapidated, the floors were buckled, none of the walls were vertical, and the roof leaked. Like some of the patients it housed, Bedlam was pronounced to be incurable. Sections of the building had to be closed off because they were essentially uninhabitable, which in turn resulted in an overcrowding of patients elsewhere. Dangerous patients were placed in cells with those who were more placid, meaning fights were commonplace and fatalities far from unheard of. Patients would often be chained together, many were naked except for a blanket, and there was no heating or hot water. All in all, it's fair to say there wasn't much chance of anybody at Bethlehem actually getting cured of anything. The following few decades saw the Board of Governors at Bethlehem oppose the reforms imposed upon them by the Parliamentary Committee, but their resistance ended in 1851 when the institution was finally taken into public hands, ending 6 centuries of independence. The hospital's notoriety was gradually brought under control, and in 1930, the establishment was moved to its present-day location in Kent. As conditions improved, so the nickname Bedlam faded. Most people who use the word these days have no idea where it came from. But perhaps that's for the best. In a world where treatment for the mentally ill is becoming better understood with every passing year, some horrors are better left in the past, where they belong. Thanks for watching.